End the conflict or face new sanctions. The US urges all sides in Ethiopia's Tigray region to negotiate peace. But will the threat be enough to stop nearly a year of fighting? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. US President Joe Biden is adding pressure on all sides to end the fighting in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. He signed an executive order threatening new sanctions against the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments, leaders of Ethiopia's Amhara region and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Biden says Ethiopia is delaying aid to people displaced by the conflict. While Tigrayan rebels welcome the announcement, Ethiopia's Prime Minister accused the US and the West of chastising his government. Abiy Ahmed says the international community is not doing enough to hold Tigrayan rebels accountable. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Shihab Ratansi in Washington.
This is not the imposition of sanctions, but another threat of sanctions. President Biden's executive order empowers the State Department and Treasury to be able to sanction those seen in the future to be standing in the way of a negotiated peace in Ethiopia on all sides. But no deadline has been announced.
If the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front take meaningful steps to enter into talks without preconditions and allow unhindered humanitarian assistance, the United States is prepared to mobilize assistance for Ethiopia to recover and revitalize its economy and build a future for its people.
State Department officials say they fear Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed will want to declare a victory over the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front when he's sworn into office on October the 4th. They also fear that the TPLF will do all it can to prevent that. The US does have a great deal of leverage over the Ethiopian government that so far it hasn't used.
Much of Ethiopia's success in the past has been in terms of trade. Its industrial parks are occupied by American multinationals benefiting from this tax benefit that was introduced 2 decades ago. And there was a fear that would be withdrawn, but that did not happen. And there's a relief in Addis Ababa.
Despite the presence in the administration of those known to be open to U.S. intervention, such as Samantha Power at USAID, it hasn't imposed punishing sanctions on the Ethiopian government. Analysts say there are multiple reasons for Washington's caution. Ethiopia is the U.S.'s main ally in the strategically important Horn of Africa and key to its projection of power across the region. Ethiopia is also important to the U.S.'s war on terror, an important component against al-Shabaab in Somalia, now that U.S. troops have officially withdrawn. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is also deregulating and privatizing the Ethiopian economy after decades of central planning, which is beneficial for U.S. multinationals. And perhaps most importantly, even as Ethiopia receives hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S., it's a key trading partner and investment destination for China. And as the Biden administration has clearly demonstrated, this is not a White House that would take a further integration of Addis Ababa and Beijing well. Shihab Ratansi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's take a closer look at the conflict in Tigray, which is now in its 11th month. The Tigray People's Liberation Front had dominated Ethiopia's politics for nearly 30 years until Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018. Last November, Abiy ordered a military operation against the group, which had retreated to Tigray, accusing it of attacking a federal military base and killing soldiers. Since then, the conflict has killed thousands of people and left nearly 1 million in famine-like conditions. The UN says more than 2 million people have been displaced. Now, in June, the African Union launched an independent inquiry into the reports of human rights violations. Eritrean forces, who were sent to Tigray when the conflict first began, have also been accused of rights abuses. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Arusha in Tanzania, Zelalem Mogus, an Ethiopian international lawyer. In Nairobi, William Davison, Ethiopia senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. And in Washington, D.C., David Shin, a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia. A warm welcome to all of you. Let's begin in Washington, D.C. first with David Shin. David, is this the threat of sanctions in order to appear like the U.S. is doing something, or is an actual real threat?
I think this is an actual real threat. It is important to underscore that these are not sanctions per se. This is the laying of the legal groundwork to permit sanctions at some point in the future against all parties who are either holding up a negotiated settlement on the one hand, or are somehow interfering with the resolution of the humanitarian crisis in northern Ethiopia. But it's for real. This is not a publicity stunt.
But what's driving it, David, then? Why now?
Well, it's really a continuation of ongoing activity by the United States under the Biden administration. They have been quite active in trying to assist some kind of end point, ceasefire, if you will, in Ethiopia, and to open up the humanitarian corridors for the different aid groups. This has been going on ever since almost the inauguration of Joe Biden. So I wouldn't suggest that this is new at all.
Ezana Mogus in Arusha, how much of this are the Ethiopian government actually going to pay attention to? Ethiopia is a key trading partner. It's a key ally. They see this as just a simple threat and won't take it that seriously, perhaps?
Well, I think it's important to note that this executive order didn't come as a surprise. Indeed, everyone was waiting for it, including the government, for quite some time. It is just that we know its content and scope right just yesterday. For many Ethiopians, including the government, the executive order is just another indication or let me say another evidence of the U.S. misguided policy towards Ethiopia. Many Ethiopians, and as I said, including the government, they believe that the executive order is grounded not in facts, but it is just ill-informed by lobbyists and TPLF propaganda networks. For the government, this executive order is devoid of contexts. It doesn't take into account the facts on the ground, and it's based on wrong assumptions and false equivalence. It's like treating unequals equally. So I don't think the government, even if it takes it seriously, I don't think the government will flinch even an inch from doing what it believes is correct. So I think that it might not bring the desired result. And I think if we see the executive order, it came against a background where the government is mobilizing hundreds of thousands of new soldiers.
Let's put your thoughts. Let's put your thoughts to David Shin. David, our guest in Arusha there has said the policy is misguided. What do you make of that?
Our friend in Arusha is simply pointing out what many in the government of Ethiopia are saying and what many in the Ethiopian diaspora are saying. I have no idea whether he personally believes that or not, but if he personally believes that, I think that there is a misunderstanding in terms of what the United States is doing. I think the United States does have access to independent information on what is happening in Ethiopia, and it's making its determination based on what it sees as facts on the ground. Now, you can interpret those differently in different ways, depending upon where you sit and where you stand. But I don't think the U.S. position is based upon bad information from misguided individuals. I think it's based on some actual facts.
William Davison in Nairobi. Sanctions, like the threat of sanctions, when it comes to a key ally of the US, like Ethiopia, what is the purpose here of sanctions? Is it simply a slap on the wrist, or is it something, like David Shin says, much more serious?
I think the purpose of the sanctions is, or the potential sanctions is pretty clearly articulated in the executive order. And they are because of, let's just say various human rights concerns about the conflict, and that's directed at all the main parties here, the Eritrean government, the Ethiopian government, also Amhara's government, and then their main opponent, the TPLF, or Tigray's former government. And the ambition from the United States, or the concern, is that all parties are still pursuing a military solution. And the United States, along with other international actors and voices, including my organization, International Crisis Group, we believe that the main priority here should be a cessation of hostilities, and then for all parties to focus on the humanitarian crisis, which is afflicting Tigray, and has been afflicting Tigray for many months, but is also now afflicting neighboring regions of Tigray, Afar and Amhara, after the Tigray forces went on an offensive in July. In addition to a ceasefire, people want to see Ethiopia's political parties who are at war, at a civil war. They want them to try and go back to peaceful politics, to return to the negotiating table, to try and come to some sort of resolution on the political issues, the electoral constitutional disagreement that led to this war, and also the broader political problems. Now, the question is the US going to be successful with the threat of sanctions or the actual application of sanctions on individuals connected to this civil war to convince them to change their stances? And whilst at International Crisis Group, we are very hopeful that a cessation of hostilities is pursued, both by the Tigray leadership, also by the federal leadership, at the moment, it does tragically look like continuing warfare is the option. I think the intentions are clear here of the US, and the reasons for that action are clear. What is not at all clear is whether they are going to be successful in getting the parties off the path of further conflict.
Zelalem, in Arusha, Ethiopia is a sovereign nation. Why should the US be involved?
Well, I think the US should be involved in this process because it's a long-standing ally of Ethiopia, and US, as a powerful nation, cannot sit idle when things are unfolding in Ethiopia. It has its own strategic interests in the Horn of Africa. I think there is no question about the need for US's involvement. The question is, how should the US involve? How should the US maintain its impartiality in this conflict? The conflict did not just start on 4th of November, but for many Ethiopians, the US is taking this conflict as if it started on 4th of November, as if it didn't have any context. Many Ethiopians, they are saying that the TPLF was in power for 27 years, and it ruled the country through dictatorship, and everybody knows that TPLF is a very well-known devil. It's not just unknown devil. So what they are saying is that the US should understand the context that led to this conflict.
But Zelalem, the context is this. The context is this. Thousands of people have been killed.
Yes.
1 million have been left in nearly famine-like conditions, and the UN says that more than 2 million have been displaced. That's a bit more than just a former government. This is a crisis, and it needs action now. Why isn't that happening?
Yes, but I think we should understand that the context includes not only the humanitarian crisis, but also the war and the background of the war. What is missing in the US policy apparently is understanding the background information. What led to this war? Why Ethiopians are saying no to the US involvement? We should understand, we should question what is the reason why Ethiopians are being more and more anti-US policy towards Ethiopia. I think that is the issue that people in the State Department should consider and honestly assess. Of course, there is a humanitarian crisis, but that humanitarian crisis is the result of the war, and the war is the result of a particular context. So there is a chain of factors, and we cannot start history on November 4th. And any policy towards Ethiopia should consider the background information, and that is what the government people are saying. And I think they have some truths there.
David Shin, I mean, Ethiopia is obviously a very clear and key ally to the United States. this is a way of putting pressure on all parties, not just the Ethiopian government, not just the Eritrean government, not just the TPLF, but all parties to try and come to, as William Davison says, a cessation of hostilities. That's really the beginning point of any negotiation. Do you think the US, David, is going about this the right way?
I think it's going about it the only way realistically that one can at the moment. I don't think the United States alone can determine the outcome of what happens in Ethiopia. It's going to require the efforts of many outside players, plus a certain willingness by all the parties in Ethiopia to compromise, which comes very hard for Ethiopians. So I think the United States is doing what it often, not always, but often does in an effort to try to encourage a negotiated solution to the problem, in addition to dealing with the humanitarian crisis. And I can't understate the concern that the U.S. has about the humanitarian crisis. The U.S. is the largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Ethiopia today, and it has traditionally been the largest donor for many decades. This is important to the United States, and it does not like to see this effort basically result in a worse situation than it has been dealing with for decades. On the issue, I want to say one comment on the issue of context. I agree that the United States needs to put all of this in context, but I would disagree that it is picking it up from November 4 of last year. We know what happened in Ethiopia since 1991 and even before that. It's also part of the context that the TPLF was the leading player in the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front from 1991 to 2018. And that's a fact. And we had to deal with that government for all of those years. So that's context too.
William Davison, one of the things our guest in Arusha is saying is that this is an unpopular policy almost across the board with Ethiopians. Are you hearing that? Are you finding that this executive order, this threat of sanctions, is actually an unpopular policy?
I think that's probably some sort of reasonable assessment of Ethiopian public opinion. But it is very hard to tell. I haven't seen any opinion polls, for example, on the matter. They're very few and far between in Ethiopia. And what we should note is just how polarized the Ethiopian political scene is, of course, like many other countries. But suffice to say, there are those who support this war and those who don't. And the support for the sanctions will break down roughly along those lines. I think, for the people in Tigray the attitude to the sanctions is going to be different for the different parties of the war for different reasons, but they will all oppose it because there's the potential for them all to be sanctioned. But across Ethiopia's political landscape, there are those constituencies which are more inclined to support the war. I think in Amhara region, we see quite strong support for the war, very strong opposition to the TPLF. That sort of positioning in Amhara region is matched in urban areas such as Addis Ababa, also amongst swathes of the diaspora. I think as we go into Oromia, where there is fairly large opposition support, we believe, of concerns about the war, they already have their own concerns and reasons for opposing Abiy Ahmed's government. That does not mean they support the TPLF, but they may be less supportive of the war and therefore less concerned about this sort of US potential action, including against federal officials. So I think it's clear why Zelalem would take that stance. It's also clear that there is plenty of very strong opposition to this type of US action, as there would be anywhere to this type of US action. But Ethiopia is polarized. And that means that there are lots of different opinions across the country.
Zelalem, I'm going to come to you in just 1 second, but I want to go to David Shin first in Washington, D.C. When we talk about sanctions, when we talk about the threat of sanctions, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This will be part of the State Department's overall strategy in Ethiopia. There'll be conversations going on with as many parties as the US can try and reach out to. Do you think that's actually happening in tandem with this executive order? Is the US speaking to as many people as possible?
I believe they are. It's also a process that very much involves the Treasury Department, because these are targeted sanctions largely against individuals, or at least that seems to be the basis for the executive order. There are also sanctions that involve series of economic issues, such as trade links, bank accounts in the United States by any of the individuals in Ethiopia who are deemed to be violating the sanctions. Some of it concerns visa policy, which persons will be allowed to enter the United States if they are deemed to be violating sanctions. So it involves a lot of activity in both the Treasury Department and the State Department. So you can be assured there's ongoing conversation there. But I suspect there's a great deal of conversation involving the intelligence agencies and any other element of the U.S. government on the ground in Ethiopia that has an understanding of the situation there.
But Zelalem, you think that the U.S. doesn't have an understanding of the situation on the ground in Ethiopia, that it's actually thinking short term. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. In my personal view, I think that the West does not fully understand. It might understand it partially, but does not fully understand the context and the facts on the ground. And it has been treating the situation casually. Like sometimes the U.S. speaks out against violations of human rights, which is okay, but only when they happen in Tigray, or when they are about to happen against the Tigrayans. So many Ethiopians are saying the US was silent when the Amharas have been invaded. They have been killed. Even like 2 weeks ago, 200 people were killed in a village in northern Amhara, but nobody spoke out against that violence. And right now, as we speak, the US, the TPLF has invaded Amhara region, some parts of Amhara. And it was also invading Afar region. So the Ethiopians are saying, does the US really understand what is going on? Even it's no longer a Tigrayan situation. It is an Ethiopian situation. It's affecting not only Tigray, but also other people, Amharas and Afars, who have equal lives with Tigrayans. So I really think that the US is treating this situation very casually. Many people might disagree because US should have the intelligence and the facts, but sometimes even if we have the facts, the way we assess them may be different, and we might have a different outcome. So I truly believe that there is a problem there. The US should try to understand why. For example, yesterday after the executive order, the TPLF welcomed
we are running out of time.
order,
I do want to come to William Davison in Nairobi. William, one of the things you said earlier was about the cessation of hostilities. That's the priority. Get everybody to stop fighting. Having heard our other two guests, do you think that's going to happen in the short term?
Well, we hope so, but it does need a significant rethink from the key actors here. I think if you look at the offensive from the Tigray forces into Amhara and Afar, they say this is to break the siege that they say the federal government has inflicted upon them. They also say they are trying to retake territory in Western Tigray that Amhara region is now administering, backed up by Ethiopian and Eritrean troops. So these are the objectives of the Tigrayan leadership, and that is leading to this very strong mobilization that Zelalem has referred to. So I think what we need to happen here ultimately is if there was some action on the humanitarian situation, so the federal government allowing unhindered access, restoring some vital services to Tigray, telecoms and electricity, banking, could the Tigray forces then agree to pause their offensive and to begin to withdraw their forces into Tigray itself? That could be the sort of bargain that we need here to kick off the beginnings of a peace process, get a cessation of hostilities, and allow the humanitarian situation to be prioritized. That would still leave very difficult political security issues, such as Western Tigray, where there is no easy resolution. But I think if the federal government finds the ability to prioritize the humanitarian situation in Tigray, give up on the concerns that humanitarian actors and supplies, maybe boosting the rebellion, but prioritize civilian lives there? Could we get a positive response from the Tigray leadership, leading to a cessation of hostilities and then a more sustained peace process?
I want to thank all our guests, Zelalem Moges in Arusha, William Davison in Nairobi, and in Washington, D.C., David Shin. And I want to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, and for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here, bye for now.